The camera glides through a bustling airport terminal, the noise of travelers, rolling suitcases, and overhead announcements filling the space. A sea of people moves in every direction, unaware of the storm about to unfold. A close-up of Vera Boli's face, calm, composed, but with a tension beneath the surface appears. She's adjusting her carry-on bag, her eyes scanning the flight details on her phone. The camera follows her as she walks confidently towards the gate, her heels clicking against the floor. As she enters the boarding area, a white woman in her mid-40s, flanked by her daughter, approaches. The woman's expression is already tense, as if she's been stewing over something for hours. Without warning, the woman speaks, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Excuse me, but you'll need to move. My daughter needs this seat." The woman gestures toward Vera's seat, her hand pointing with an air of entitlement. Her voice drips with impatience. The tone isn't a question, it's an order. Vera pauses, her calm demeanor never wavering. Her gaze meets the woman's, and for a split second, a silent exchange happens, one that speaks volumes. Vera takes a breath. She doesn't answer immediately, but her eyes narrow slightly, the weight of the moment growing. As passengers nearby shift uncomfortably, Vera rises from her seat, preparing for what she knows is about to escalate. The woman doesn't wait for a response, speaking again in a sharper voice. "It's just for a few hours. Move. You'll be fine." The woman's words hang in the air, but Vera doesn't flinch. Instead, she stands, silent, her eyes never leaving the woman's face. The entire scene becomes a standoff, the tension palpable in the space between them. A few passengers glance over, some whispering to each other, others too scared to speak up. But the moment doesn't end there. As the woman raises her voice, the flight attendants appear, and what starts as a simple seat dispute quickly turns into something far bigger. They don't ask Vera if she's okay. They don't even pause to consider her side. Without warning, they demand she vacate her seat, her calm defiance only making the situation worse. Will Vera stand her ground? Or will she be forced into silence? Before the situation spirals out of control, the sound of a pilot's voice crackles over the intercom. It's a voice that will change everything. Don't go anywhere. What happens next will surprise you. If you're enjoying the story so far, make sure to hit the subscribe button and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. We love hearing from viewers around the world. Vera Boli has always been someone who commands attention. A woman of poise, strength, and grace, she's carved out a path in a world where others like her often struggle to be seen. As a high-level executive in a competitive industry, she's faced more than her fair share of challenges. But through every obstacle, Vera has come out on top, her career a testament to the power of resilience. She didn't start with privilege or an easy road. She came from modest beginnings, built herself from the ground up, and earned every accolade that now sits comfortably on her resume. Over the years, she's become a role model to many, not just for her professional success, but for the way she handles herself in a world that often doesn't understand her. Yet, for all her triumphs, for all her accomplishments, Vera has learned one undeniable truth. Success doesn't always shield you from prejudice. As she steps into the terminal, her heels clicking steadily on the polished floor, her mind is focused. It's just another business trip, another flight to handle, but there's a quiet unease in the pit of her stomach, one that she can't shake. I've faced my fair share of discrimination, but I've always found ways to rise above it. I built my career from the ground up, and now I get to enjoy the perks of success. But this flight, it was a reminder that success doesn't always shield you from prejudice. No matter how many milestones I've reached, there's always someone ready to make me feel small again. Vera enters the plane with the quiet confidence that has always marked her. She greets the flight attendants with a nod, walking past the rows of seats. The first-class cabin beckons, her sanctuary, where she can finally relax, away from the pressures of the boardroom and the constant demands of her role. She settles into her seat with ease, adjusting her jacket and placing her carry-on neatly beside her. The hum of the aircraft as it prepares for takeoff offers a strange sense of comfort. She exhales, trying to shake off the stress of the day, but there's something different about this flight, something she can't quite put her finger on. It was a short business trip, one I had made countless times before. I knew the drill. Arrive, settle in, handle the work, and get back home. It was routine, but that day, something was different. As Vera relaxes in her seat, she glances out the window, the distant city skyline slowly disappearing beneath the clouds. Her thoughts drift to the meetings ahead, the people she will be negotiating with, and the deal that's about to unfold. She's at the top of her game, the culmination of years of dedication. She deserves this moment of peace before the whirlwind begins. But as the plane begins its ascent, a shift in the air cuts through the tranquility. She feels it before she hears the voice, a sharp, demanding tone that instantly brings her back to the present. Vera's professional armor is strong, but no matter how much she's been through, moments like this always take her by surprise. The voice, loud and entitled, pierces through the calm. The confrontation is about to begin. I was ready to ignore the noise, but this time I couldn't. What happened next? It would change everything. The camera lingers on Vera's composed face as she takes a deep breath. She's no stranger to conflicts, but she has always learned to handle them with grace. However, this was different. Something about this moment made her realize that no matter how high you rise, some people still think they can push you down. The unsettling sense that something's off begins to settle in as the conflict grows, and the voice that once seemed so distant now takes center stage. The plane had barely reached cruising altitude when Vera felt a presence beside her. A white woman, likely in her mid-40s, stood by her seat. Vera looked up from her tablet, her fingers still gently tapping on the screen. She didn't recognize the woman, but the air around them was already thick with something unspoken. The woman smiled, but there was no warmth in it. It was a tight, forced gesture, almost rehearsed. "Excuse me," she began, her voice pitched just slightly too loud, carrying across the cabin, "but I'll need you to move." Vera raised an eyebrow, unsure if she had heard correctly. The woman continued without missing a beat. "My daughter needs this seat. Yours is too far from the rest of the family." Vera's calm eyes met the woman's, but she didn't immediately respond. She took a brief moment to process. She was used to this, used to being underestimated, used to people thinking they could dictate her space. What she wasn't used to was the assumption that she would simply comply without question. She was a black woman in a world that frequently sought to make her feel invisible. But she had spent years mastering the art of remaining unshaken. No matter how deep the insult ran, I wasn't surprised at the request. These things happen, but what struck me was how she spoke to me. She didn't ask. She demanded. She acted like it was my duty to move, like I had no say in the matter, like I wasn't even worthy of a conversation. And that was where she made her mistake. Vera exhaled slowly and sat up straighter, her body language shifting from relaxed to deliberate. She glanced at the daughter, who stood by silently, looking uncomfortable but not speaking up. The woman's tone had been casual, even as her words had the sharpness of entitlement. She was acting like this was a minor inconvenience for Vera, a small sacrifice that shouldn't warrant any discussion. Vera's response was simple, but her words carried weight. "No," she said quietly, firmly. "This is my seat, and I'll be staying here." The woman's smile faltered, but she wasn't finished. "But my daughter is just a few rows behind," the woman persisted, her voice rising slightly. "She needs to be with her family. Surely, this won't be a problem." Vera's hands remained still on the armrests, her posture unyielding. "I've paid for this seat, just like you've paid for yours. I'm not moving." The exchange should have ended there, but the air between them was still charged, a silent countdown to something much worse. The woman's face tightened, and she glanced around at the flight attendants, as if seeking reinforcement. That's when the tension began to escalate. The flight attendants, a pair of young women in crisp uniforms, appeared at the side of Vera's seat. They looked at the woman first, then at Vera, but neither offered a greeting or asked if everything was okay. They simply stood there, waiting. When the crew came over, they didn't even ask me if I was okay with the change. They didn't ask if I wanted to move. They just assumed it was my place to move. And I wasn't having it. The taller flight attendant, a woman with short blonde hair and an expression that looked more irritated than polite, addressed Vera with a professional tone. "We're going to need you to vacate this seat," she said, her voice even but carrying an undeniable edge. Vera's eyes widened slightly, a mix of disbelief and frustration. She'd been through this before, but that didn't make it any easier to stomach. The flight attendant didn't even look at her boarding pass to verify whether Vera had a right to be there. She was simply repeating the demand the white woman had made, with no attempt to consider Vera's side of the story. "I'm sorry, but I'm not moving," Vera replied again, her voice calm but unyielding. The second flight attendant, a woman of color, glanced between Vera and the woman who had asked her to move. Vera could see the conflict in the attendant's eyes, but instead of speaking up or offering any support, she remained silent. It was a moment of painful realization, just how deep systemic bias could run, even in spaces that were supposed to be neutral. The blonde flight attendant sighed, her patience clearly wearing thin. "Ma'am, we need to resolve this. Please, follow our instructions. It's only for a few minutes." Vera stood her ground, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on her chest. She could feel the eyes of the passengers around her, the growing awareness of what was happening. Some were whispering to each other, others watching with barely concealed judgment. Vera could already tell how this was going to play out. The polite requests would soon turn into demands, and the situation was about to spiral. But she wouldn't give in. Not this time. "You can't just take my seat because someone else is uncomfortable with where they're sitting," Vera said, her voice sharp now, cutting through the tension in the cabin. "I have a right to be here, and I'm not moving." The flight attendants exchanged a look, but neither of them spoke. The longer the conversation dragged on, the more the atmosphere thickened with discomfort. The woman who had initiated the conflict stood there, her arms crossed, visibly agitated, watching the flight attendants as they hesitated. It wasn't long before the airline's crew's supervisor approached, a man who immediately sided with the white woman, raising the stakes of the argument. Vera could feel her patience starting to fray as the entire scenario turned into a public spectacle. The tension in the cabin thickened as Vera stood firm, refusing to budge. The flight attendants, now joined by the supervisor, continued their attempts to persuade her to leave her seat, but each argument was met with the same calm, resolute response. Vera wasn't moving, and she made it clear that she wasn't going to be intimidated. As the minutes ticked by, passengers started to notice. Conversations that had been carried on in quiet whispers suddenly stopped as people turned their attention toward the unfolding drama. Some passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Others openly stared, their faces painted with varying shades of judgment or sympathy. People were starting to notice. Some gave me sympathetic glances. Others whispered. And that's when it happened. The woman started calling for security. The white woman's frustration boiled over. She was no longer trying to maintain the calm exterior that had initially marked her behavior. Her voice cracked with anger as she turned toward the attendants, demanding, "This is unacceptable. I paid for this flight and she's refusing to comply. Get security, now." At first, the request was met with hesitation. The attendants exchanged a brief look, but the supervisor nodded, his expression hardening. He motioned for one of the crew members to leave, presumably to call for security. Vera's stomach twisted, not with fear, but with the all-too-familiar sting of being forced into a corner, a victim of a system that was designed to silence her. As the flight attendants moved away to make the call, Vera remained seated, her hands resting calmly on her lap. She looked out the window, her mind racing, but her face unwavering. She wasn't just fighting for the seat now. She was fighting for her dignity, her right to exist in this space as much as anyone else. She wasn't going to let them push her into compliance. It wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about what that moment symbolized. My dignity was being stripped away, and I wasn't going to let them do it. Not this time. The quiet whispers from passengers continued, growing louder as they exchanged their opinions on what was happening. Some passengers sided with Vera, quietly offering her support with a nod or a small word of encouragement. Others, however, didn't hide their disdain. They exchanged looks with the white woman, and the tension in the air only grew thicker as the moment dragged on. Vera could feel the weight of their gazes, and in a way, it made her even more determined to stand her ground. This wasn't just a fight with the flight attendants or the white woman. It was a fight with every assumption people had about who belonged where, about whose comfort mattered more. The sound of footsteps approached, and Vera knew what was coming. A security officer entered the cabin, his uniform stark against the soft lighting of the aircraft. He walked up to her seat, and without a word, he gestured for her to stand. His eyes briefly flickered between Vera and the flight attendants, who stood in the background, silent. "Ma'am," the officer began, his voice neutral, almost robotic. "You need to vacate this seat. I'm going to have to ask you to follow me." The air was thick with the collective breath of passengers, all waiting for Vera's response. She remained still, staring up at the officer with a calmness that contrasted the chaos around her. I wasn't moving. I wasn't going to let them humiliate me. But what I was about to face wasn't just about the seat. It was the same battle I've fought all my life, the battle for my voice, for my space. They wanted me to shrink, but I wouldn't. Her voice was firm as she addressed the officer. "I've paid for this seat. I'm not going anywhere." The security officer's face remained impassive, but there was a flicker of something beneath his eyes. Whether it was annoyance or discomfort, Vera couldn't tell. It didn't matter. She wasn't going to let him or anyone else make her feel small. But the situation wasn't just about a seat or the flight attendants anymore. It was about power and the stark, uncomfortable reality of who held it in that moment. And in that moment, Vera was powerless, and she knew it. The officer stepped closer, placing a hand on the armrest as if to signal that there was no more room for negotiation. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave your seat now," he said again, more insistent this time. Vera stood, the weight of the moment settling into her bones. She wasn't afraid. She had never been afraid. But she was angry. Angry that in this day and age, a woman of her stature, of her accomplishments, still had to fight just to be respected. Angry that this was happening in front of her, that she was being made an example of for no other reason than the color of her skin. As she stood and gathered her things, she could hear the low murmurs of passengers. Some shook their heads, others openly looked away, but there were a few brave enough to watch, to bear witness. The white woman who had started the whole thing stood to the side, her arms folded, her face a mixture of triumph and satisfaction. She had won. At least that's what she thought. But what she didn't realize was that the real cost of this victory wouldn't be felt by Vera. It would be felt by the airline. It would be felt by anyone who had ever witnessed this, and it would echo in the halls of corporate boardrooms and legal offices for a long time to come. I wasn't just being removed from a seat, I was being forced to shrink, to be small, to be less than. And for what? For refusing to give in to someone who thought they could dictate my worth? Vera was escorted from her seat by the officer, her head held high. The other passengers watched, some with shame, some with indifference, and some with quiet approval. But Vera knew that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The flight was a blur. As Vera made her way back to her original seat, the eyes of the other passengers seemed to follow her, some with pity, others with curiosity. The air around her felt thick, as if every eye on the plane was waiting for something to happen. But Vera didn't look at them. She kept her head high, her stride steady. She was no stranger to conflict, especially conflict that tried to erase her presence. But this was different. The flight attendants moved quickly. Their earlier attempts to coax her into compliance, now replaced by an almost robotic indifference. The situation had become a spectacle, and no one on board seemed willing to break the silence. But in Vera's mind, there was no more room for silence. This wasn't just about a seat or an uncomfortable interaction. This was about something much bigger. But they didn't know who I was. They didn't know that this wasn't just about a seat. This was about respect, and I wasn't going to let it slide. As Vera sat back down, the weight of the moment pressed into her chest, but her resolve only solidified. What had just happened wasn't just an isolated incident on a plane. It was a symbol of something much more ingrained. A system that told her time and time again that her space, her place, was something that could be taken, pushed aside, and diminished. But this time was different. She pulled out her phone, her fingers tapping rapidly against the screen. As the plane continued to soar high above the clouds, her mind was already elsewhere. back to the series of high-stakes meetings she had scheduled with the airline's executives. She wasn't just a passenger on that plane. She was a key player in a deal that could potentially reshape the future of the airline's expansion into new markets. Vera wasn't just sitting in that first-class seat for leisure. She was on the verge of finalizing a multi-million-dollar deal, one that the airline had been eagerly pursuing for months. They needed her. They needed her influence, her expertise, and her market access. But what they didn't know was that with this moment, Vera was quietly deciding whether she would let them have it. This was no ordinary flight. I was in talks with the airline for a multi-million-dollar deal. But at that moment, I wasn't thinking about money. I wasn't thinking about how this could affect the bottom line. I was thinking about how I would handle this, how I would make them understand what they'd done. Her fingers moved across the screen again, but this time it wasn't just a quick email or text. This was more deliberate, more thought out. Vera wasn't just drafting a message, she was crafting a statement. The words she typed could change everything. They could undo years of effort in an instant. But if they were going to disrespect her, they needed to know the price of that disrespect. The flight attendants, who had continued to serve other passengers with a polite, distant demeanor, began to move away from Vera's seat, leaving her with the growing sense that the drama had come to an end. But it hadn't. This wasn't a one-time misunderstanding. It was a breaking point. Vera's phone vibrated. A few quick glances confirmed that she had received the first in a series of emails from her team, detailing the final stages of negotiations with the airline. This was the big one. The deal that could redefine the industry. Yet the only thing on her mind now was the principle behind this negotiation. Was she really willing to let an organization that treated her like this have any part in her business future? They thought this was about me getting a seat, but what they didn't realize was that this was about me standing up for something bigger. It wasn't about the flight, or the seat, or the convenience of one person's daughter. It was about what I had to teach them. She set her phone down with a finality that resonated deeper than the sound of the device hitting the tray table. Her decision was made. The moment she had been waiting for, the opportunity to make her move, had arrived. As the plane continued its journey, the real tension built in the quiet moments, in the space between the flight attendants' glances and the occasional nervous whispers from the other passengers. They had no idea what was unfolding behind the scenes. But Vera was calm. She was prepared. The airline's executives had no clue that what they thought was a simple negotiation was about to take a drastic turn. They assumed that Vera, the seasoned businesswoman, would be too focused on the potential millions she could gain to let something so trivial as a seat change shake her. They assumed she would quietly accept the injustice and move on, because that's what people like her were supposed to do. But Vera wasn't like the others. She wasn't a passive participant in her own story. I was done pretending. I wasn't going to let them get away with it. They thought they could control this. They thought I was just another passenger. But they were about to find out just how wrong they were. She knew the consequences of her decision. Walking away from this deal meant more than just turning her back on a single negotiation. It meant losing potential revenue. Yes, but it also meant sending a message that says, "This is not how you treat me. This is not how you treat anyone." As the plane began its descent, Vera made the call. The email was sent. The message was clear. No deal. No partnership. Not until there was an apology. Not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel small, invisible, or unimportant in a space they had every right to occupy. And when that decision was made, when I walked away from that deal, it wasn't just about the money. It was about making them understand that this moment, this injustice, would cost them far more than they could ever imagine. The plane began its descent, and with it, the weight of Vera's decision settled in. She wasn't just changing her flight path, she was changing the course of her life, and possibly the future of the airline itself. As the plane began its descent toward its destination, Vera sat back in her seat, her fingers once again tracing the outline of her phone. The decision she had made wasn't just about refusing to let go of a seat. It was a symbol of a much deeper issue, one that so many people of color faced every day, often without the ability to do anything about it. This wasn't just about a seat on a plane. This was about every space, every institution, and every moment where people like her were forced to fight for what they deserved. And in this moment, Vera knew that she had the power to change it. The aircraft began its final approach, and Vera's thoughts drifted away from the chaos around her. She had made her move. Now the wheels of change were in motion. But as she looked out the window, watching the world below shrink into a blur of city lights, she couldn't help but wonder, how often did this happen without anyone noticing? How many voices were silenced, just like hers could have been, if not for the courage to stand up? None of this should be surprising, not in a world where our rights are so often trampled. But still, when I think about it, I wonder, how often does this happen? And how many people, just like me, have to quietly accept it every day? The wheels of the plane touched the tarmac, and the sudden movement jerked Vera from her thoughts. The flight attendants, still maintaining their professionalism, moved swiftly through the cabin, ensuring that passengers prepared for the landing. But Vera's mind was already elsewhere, on the future. What would this moment change? What would her actions mean? Not just for the airline, but for anyone who had ever felt like their seat, their place, their rights didn't matter. She thought about the hundreds of other Black travelers who had faced the same treatment, maybe not in such a dramatic fashion, but in the everyday microaggressions that were often invisible to those who didn't experience them. The discrimination that wasn't always overt, but was deeply ingrained in the fabric of society. The subtle messages that said you don't belong here, or you're not as important as others. And Vera couldn't help but reflect on her own journey. How many times had she been told that she didn't belong, that she wasn't good enough? How many times had she had to fight, not just for a seat on a plane, but for her place in a world that often felt like it was made for someone else? What if I hadn't been the CEO of my company? What if I was just a 16-year-old girl, or a young woman on her first job, trying to make her way in the world? What if no one was there to witness what happened? What if no one cared? It's not just about one seat. It's about how often these things go unnoticed, how often they're ignored, brushed aside. Her mind raced as she considered the bigger implications. What if the woman had been treated differently? What if the airline staff had taken a moment to truly listen to her, to understand her point of view, instead of dismissing her as a problem to be solved? But Vera knew, deep down, that this wasn't just about one encounter. This was about a system that normalized these injustices, that allowed this to happen time and time again. She had lived through enough to understand that racism didn't take a day off. It was something that festered in the smallest moments, in the quietest exchanges, in the actions that weren't ever questioned. This wasn't just a random act. It was a small piece in the puzzle of a system that makes you feel like you don't deserve to be where you are. It's the same system that made the woman think she had the right to demand my seat. It's the same system that told the flight attendants to ignore me, to treat me like I didn't matter. It's the system that makes so many people, just like me, feel like we're always one step away from being told to get up, to move, to make way for someone else. Her phone buzzed again. The emails were flooding in now. Messages from her team, updates on the deal with the airline, more information about the ongoing negotiations. But none of it seemed as important anymore. She had already made her decision. Her heart wasn't in the deal anymore. Not after what had just happened. The world outside the window grew clearer as the plane touched down. The finality of the landing brought with it an unexpected clarity for Vera. This wasn't just a moment in time. It was a turning point, one that would shape not only her future, but the way she saw the world. It wasn't about the money, the contracts, or the deals. It was about the principles that had guided her through her career, through her life. It was about the dignity she had fought so hard to maintain, and the reminder that no one could take that from her. I wasn't going to let this moment pass without making them understand. This wasn't just about walking away from a deal. It was about sending a message. That's why, when I made the call to pull out of the negotiations, I knew I was making the right decision. No amount of money, no deal, No partnership was worth sacrificing my integrity. This wasn't about me getting a seat. It was about everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. And this time, I wasn't going to let them win. As the plane came to a complete stop, Vera gathered her belongings, ready to disembark. Her heart was steady, her mind clear. She had made her stand, and the world was about to hear it. The moment Vera stepped off the plane, the weight of what had transpired began to settle on her shoulders. The flight had ended, but the story wasn't over. It was only just beginning. She wasn't sure what the next steps would look like, but one thing was certain: she wasn't going to let this incident slip away into the shadows. The events that had unfolded were not just personal. They were representative of something much larger, something systemic that needed to be addressed. Back at the airport terminal, as she made her way to the baggage claim, her phone buzzed incessantly. It was her assistant, her legal team, and a few trusted colleagues, all reaching out with messages and calls. They had already heard about what had happened on the flight. The ripple effect had begun. News had spread faster than she expected, and the calls of support, questions, and offers for legal action were already flooding in. But Vera wasn't interested in the media storm or any sensationalism. What mattered to her now was how to use this moment to fuel real change. Her career had been built on making an impact. But this wasn't just about business. It was about dignity, justice, and the acknowledgement of every person who had faced similar moments of racial indignity. I could have stayed quiet. I could have accepted the apology they would inevitably offer, apologized for the inconvenience, and moved on. But that's not how I've built my life, and that's not what I want to teach the next generation. No one should have to silently endure being treated like they don't matter. As Vera made her way through the airport, she stopped to think about the power of what she was holding in her hands. This wasn't just an isolated incident. This was a microcosm of the daily injustices faced by people of color, especially Black women. The apology from the airline would come, of course, but that wouldn't erase what had happened. That wouldn't undo the harm that was done when the flight attendants and then the security officer disregarded her humanity in favor of a woman who assumed her space was less valuable. What happened to me on that flight? It wasn't just one person's mistake. It wasn't an isolated incident. It's a pattern that exists in every corner of our society. People are quick to make assumptions about others based on their skin color. But I wasn't going to let this become just another forgotten moment. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about everyone who has ever had to be silent in the face of racism. Vera called her team on the way home, laying out her next steps. She wasn't going to let this incident fade into the background. She decided then and there to make a public stand. She would use her platform, her influence, and her position in the business world to shine a light on what had happened, to show others that they didn't have to accept this kind of behavior. Over the next few days, Vera drafted an open letter. It wasn't a letter of apology for causing a scene. It was a letter to the airline, to the flight attendants, and to anyone who had ever been made to feel small because of their race. She wasn't going to just complain about what happened. She was going to use it to fuel her advocacy for racial equity and fair treatment in all spaces, from corporate boardrooms to public transportation. She was clear in her message. We don't have to accept racism as a given. We don't have to quietly tolerate these microaggressions. We can choose to stand up, and when we do, we make it easier for those who come after us. Vera's open letter was published on social media, gaining traction quickly. It wasn't long before it was shared by industry leaders, influencers, and organizations advocating for racial equality. The conversation started to shift. No longer was this an isolated incident. It became part of a larger dialogue about race and privilege in professional and public spaces. People who had witnessed the event, both on the flight and afterward, began to speak out, sharing their own stories of discrimination, offering words of solidarity, and demanding accountability. Her story reverberated beyond the walls of the airline and beyond the airport terminal. It touched a nerve in people who had long been silent, who had quietly accepted the status quo out of fear of losing their position or standing. Vera had given them permission to speak out, to take a stand. This wasn't just about what happened on that flight. It was about creating a shift. When people began to share their own stories, when they began to realize they weren't alone, that's when I knew this moment had to become something more. It had to be the spark. Vera didn't just stop with the letter. She began to take action in other ways. She reached out to advocacy groups that focused on racial justice, offering her support and resources. She spoke to business leaders about how they could foster more inclusive and equitable workplaces. She began working with legislators to push for policies that would protect travelers from discrimination, particularly in the air travel industry. Her story became a rallying cry for those who had been marginalized, for those who had been made to feel like they were invisible. Vera Bowley's refusal to back down in the face of racial injustice wasn't just a personal victory. It was a collective one. It wasn't just about me. It was about making sure the next generation, the next person who faces what I did, doesn't have to face it alone. We can make change, but we have to be brave enough to speak up. We have to be brave enough to say, "This isn't okay, and I won't be silenced." As Vera stood in the airport watching people come and go, she realized that she had already won. Not just the battle, but the war against complacency. The world was changing, and she had just made it a little bit easier for others to demand their place at the table. Her response had become the beginning of a new chapter, one where silence was no longer an option, and where the courage to speak out could move mountains. Here's the revised version of the last two chapters to avoid repetition and ensure a smoother progression from the audience impacts reflections to the closing and call to action. In the days that followed Vera's letter, the conversation that had been ignited continued to grow, gaining momentum and drawing in voices from all corners of society. What had started as a personal stand against racial injustice on a flight had quickly blossomed into a global conversation about systemic inequality. People from all walks of life began to reach out, their stories flooding in with gratitude, support, and solidarity. Messages poured in from people who had witnessed similar acts of discrimination, their own experiences of feeling overlooked or diminished suddenly validated. Vera's courage had given them permission to speak out, to share the microaggressions, the overt acts of racism they'd quietly tolerated for years. People began to share their stories with me, stories that were painful, raw, and often held in silence for far too long. These weren't isolated incidents. These were moments that too many of us had to endure, time and time again, and no one ever spoke up. In interviews and public discussions, Vera spoke not just about her personal experience, but about the bigger picture. The countless everyday moments where people were made to feel invisible, small, or unwelcome. She shared the overwhelming number of messages she had received from those who had been similarly treated but had never felt they had the power to confront it. As the days passed, the story began to snowball. It wasn't just about the airline anymore. It was about a cultural shift, a reckoning for how society viewed race, privilege, and equality. The incident had gone viral. But more importantly, it had sparked a real conversation. People were talking about the ways that racial bias showed up in their own lives, whether in the workplace, on public transportation, or in casual encounters. The conversation was no longer just happening in private, whispered exchanges. It was public now, loud and unapologetic. I didn't do this for fame, and I certainly didn't do it for the media attention. But what I did do was make sure that the conversation didn't stop with me. It couldn't stop. It had to grow. And it did. People began to realize that this wasn't just about one flight. It was about a system of privilege that had gone unchallenged for far too long. The airline, reeling from the public backlash, issued a formal apology. But for many, the apology felt like a thin attempt to deflect from the deeper issue at hand. Vera knew the real challenge wasn't in the public apology. It was in the structural changes that needed to follow. Accountability, not words, would ensure that this incident wasn't forgotten. Her decision to speak out had opened the door for others to share their experiences, and together, they began to create a collective narrative. With each new story, the movement grew stronger, more widespread. People of all races, ethnicities, and backgrounds were finding common ground, united by a desire to see the world change. Vera had become a beacon for those who had long remained in the shadows, their voices lost to fear or indifference. And now they were speaking out, empowered by her example. In the aftermath of it all, as Vera sat quietly in her office, the gravity of the situation began to sink in. The world had changed in a way that no one could have predicted. What had started as a simple confrontation on a plane had snowballed into a movement. People were no longer willing to stay silent. They were no longer willing to let these injustices go unchallenged. And Vera knew that this was just the beginning. I didn't ask for this fight. I didn't ask for the attention. But when it came, I knew I couldn't walk away. I couldn't pretend like nothing had happened. Not when so many people had silently endured the same treatment. This wasn't just about me. It was about all of us. It was about making sure no one ever has to be silenced again. Vera paused for a moment, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of her desk. She thought about the young woman who would now board a flight without fearing that someone would tell her she didn't belong. She thought about the next generation, those who wouldn't have to accept the prejudices that had been ingrained in society for so long. The fight wasn't over. But in this moment, Vera felt a deep sense of pride. Her refusal to remain silent had sparked something far bigger than she could have imagined. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for all those who had been pushed to the margins, all those whose voices had been muffled by a system that sought to keep them in place. This isn't just my victory. This is a victory for every person who has ever felt they weren't good enough, for every person who has had to fight for a place at the table. We can do better, and we will. Together. The screen slowly fades to black, Vera's words lingering in the silence. And then, the screen fills with a quote that perfectly encapsulates everything Vera stood for. Justice will not be served until those who are unaffected are as outraged as those who are. Benjamin Franklin. What would you have done if you were in Vera's shoes? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of courage and change.